"My turn," she said. Colonel Victor Reynolds burst out laughing, right in her face. 28 elite SEAL snipers turned to stare at the woman standing behind the observation line. A desk officer, an analyst. Someone who filed reports and tracked inventory. Nobody moved to hand her a rifle. Nobody took her seriously. Nobody except Admiral Whitmore, who had been watching her eyes for the last 3 minutes, and what he saw there made him go very quiet. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Sarah's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rifle crack from firing position 7 still hung in the air. When Master Chief Donovan Reese stood up, pulled off his shooting glove, and walked away from the line without a word. That said everything. 28 shots. 28 misses. The best long-range shooters the United States Navy had produced in a generation, men who had trained through conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. Men who had made shots in combat that textbooks said were impossible, and not one of them had touched the target sitting 4,000 meters across the Black Ridge Valley. Nobody was angry anymore. That was the worst part. After the first several misses, there had been frustration adjustment strategy. Now there was something quieter. The particular silence of men who had reached the edge of what they believed they were capable of, and looked over that edge and found nothing on the other side. Admiral Daniel Whitmore stood behind the range line with his hands clasped behind his back and his face showing exactly nothing. That was a skill he had spent 30 years developing. You did not let men see your doubt. You especially did not let elite operators see it because they would carry it with them like an infection. Colonel Victor Reynolds stepped up beside him. Reynolds was the senior training officer, career military, the kind of man who wore his medals like a second skin and believed that institutional excellence was measured in decades of procedure. "Sir," Reynolds said, keeping his voice low, "we should call the evaluation. The conditions today are simply outside acceptable parameters for a meaningful test." Whitmore didn't answer immediately. He was watching the flags strung across the valley floor at 500-meter intervals. They were moving differently from each other. At the firing line, the flag pushed eastward at roughly 8 knots. 700 meters out, the flag barely moved. 1,500 meters, it changed direction entirely. Beyond that, the heat shimmer made it nearly impossible to read. The wind wasn't one problem. It was 6 different problems stacked inside each other, and every one of those problems changed every 90 seconds. "The conditions are what they are," Whitmore finally said. "If a real mission required this shot, the conditions wouldn't negotiate with us." Reynolds pressed his lips together, but said nothing more. Behind them, 28 of the finest shooters in special operations stood in small groups. Some were talking quietly. Chief Aaron Blake, who had been running precision shooting programs for the Navy for nearly 2 decades, was sitting alone on an equipment case, with his elbows on his knees, staring at the valley floor. Blake wasn't the type to visibly show defeat, but something about his posture communicated it clearly enough. The young shooter, nearest the observation rope, was Petty Officer, First Class, Marcus Webb. 26 years old. 2 combat deployments, confirmed long-range engagements that had earned him significant recognition within the SEAL community. He had been the last man to shoot, and he had missed by what the spotting team estimated as 9 meters left at distance. 9 meters, against a target that measured roughly 40 centimeters across. Webb was cleaning his bolt with a cloth that didn't need it, doing something with his hands so he wouldn't have to think. That was when he heard the voice. It came from behind the observation rope from the cluster of non-shooter personnel who had been standing well back from the firing line. Support staff, intelligence analysts, logistics officers. The kind of people who attended these evaluations because someone higher up the chain had decided they needed visibility into classified programs. "Sir." The voice was female, measured, completely calm. "I'd like to try." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. Not the silence of consideration, the silence of people who weren't sure they had heard correctly. Admiral Whitmore turned. Standing just behind the rope was Commander Sarah Mitchell, 37 years old, Naval Intelligence. Her record showed 9 years of analytical work, mission data processing, threat assessment, pattern recognition. She was known, to the extent she was known at all, as exceptionally competent in a field where exceptionally competent people were rarely noticed. She was not on the shooter roster. She was not part of the evaluation team. She was here because she had been assigned 6 weeks ago to provide intelligence support to the Black Ridge program. That meant she sat in briefings, prepared data packages, and stayed out of the way. Now she was standing at the observation rope asking to take a shot that 28 trained SEAL snipers had just failed to make. Colonel Reynolds recovered first. "Commander Mitchell." His voice carried the particular tone of a senior officer correcting a junior officer who has misunderstood the room. Patient. Condescending. Like explaining something to someone who should already know better. "This is a precision qualification evaluation. These are the finest shooters we have. This isn't a classroom exercise where everyone gets a participation opportunity." "I understand that, sir." "You are an intelligence analyst." "Yes, sir. You analyze reports." Reynolds gestured at the firing line, at the men standing there, at the equipment cases and spotting scopes, and all the infrastructure of serious professional marksmanship. "These men have spent their careers making impossible shots. There is no version of this where—" "Sir." Sarah's voice didn't rise. It didn't sharpen. It just held. "If I miss, you lose 5 minutes, and the evaluation ends the same way it was going to end. If I hit, you get your answer." She let that sit. Reynolds turned to Whitmore, expression clear, put this to rest. But Whitmore was still looking at her. He had looked at thousands of people across a long career. He had learned slowly, and not without painful experience, to pay attention to the ones who didn't look like they were performing. Performers had a quality to them, a visibility, an energy that was about being seen, doing something. The best people in any room had the opposite quality. They were focused entirely on the thing itself, not on anyone watching them do it. Sarah Mitchell was looking at the valley. Not at him, not at Reynolds, not at the SEALs watching her. She was looking at the flags. 5 minutes, Whitmore said. Reynolds turned to him sharply. "Sir." "Colonel, 5 minutes." The range went quiet in a different way. Marcus Webb stopped cleaning his bolt. Chief Blake raised his head. Reynolds said nothing more, but his jaw was tight enough to be visible from 20 feet away. Sarah ducked under the observation rope and walked toward the equipment area at the back of the line. She had a case with her that nobody had noticed before, the way nobody notices things that don't appear to matter. Old, worn aluminum. The latches replaced at some point, scratches in the finish that told a story nobody had asked to hear. She set it down on an open equipment table and opened it. Webb moved closer without quite deciding to. Inside the case was a rifle. But not the kind of rifle he was used to seeing in this context. The precision platforms used by the SEAL evaluation team were the product of enormous investment, purpose-built systems, suppressed with advanced optics and custom ammunition, developed specifically for extended-range work. What Sarah lifted out was something else entirely. An older platform. The action was clearly hand-fitted, the barrel replaced at some point, with work that looked custom, but not institutional. The stock had been modified extensively by the look of it, but not recently. This was equipment that had been worked on over years, adjusted and refined through a relationship that wasn't about appearance. It looked, Webb thought, like a tool, not a showpiece. "That's what you're planning to use," he said. It came out with more incredulity than he intended, but not entirely more than he felt. Sarah glanced at him briefly. "You have a problem with it." "It doesn't look like—" He searched for diplomatic language and didn't find it quickly enough. "I mean, for 4,000 meters you'd normally want—" "The rifle knows its job," she said. "I know its job. That's the only compatibility that matters." She said it without heat. Like a statement of fact that happened to also be a correction. Webb watched her perform a press check and then begin working through a series of adjustments at the scope that he recognized as deliberate and systematic, but that also followed an internal logic he couldn't entirely track. She wasn't checking boxes. She was doing something more specific than that. 2,000 meters, she said without looking up. He blinked. "What?" "When I asked your best confirmed shot record earlier, You said 2,000 meters. She finished her scope adjustment and stood. That's excellent work, genuinely. 2,000 meters under real-world conditions takes everything you have. He wasn't sure if he was being complimented or set up. But you're right that 4,000 is a different problem, he said, feeling for the first time like he was in a conversation rather than a confrontation. I know the math. I tried to solve it today and couldn't. It's not unsolvable, Sarah said. The math isn't the problem. Then what is? She looked at the valley, then at him. Time, she said. Patience. Most people treat a shot like a problem to overcome. They fight the conditions. They work against the wind. They try to find a moment when everything lines up perfectly, and when that moment doesn't come, they push. She picked up the rifle. You can't push 4,000 meters. The bullet is in the air for more than 5 seconds. Every variable you didn't account for has 5 full seconds to express itself. Webb stared at her. So what do? You stop fighting and start listening. She walked to the firing position. Chief Blake watched her approach. He had been in this business long enough to see a wide spectrum of shooters, the technically gifted, the mechanically sound, the purely determined. He had watched men with extraordinary natural talent struggle because they approached precision shooting as a matter of will. He had watched men with more modest talent achieve remarkable things because they had understood somewhere along the way that the discipline was not about domination, it was about relationship. The way Sarah Mitchell carried that rifle told him something he hadn't expected to conclude this afternoon. She had been here before, not at Black Ridge, not necessarily, but at this kind of place, the place at the far edge of what was possible, where the conditions were hostile and the window was narrow and the margin was essentially zero. She had been there before, and she had come home. He didn't know how he knew that. He just did. Sarah settled behind the rifle. The range went quiet, in a way it hadn't been all afternoon. Not the quiet of a pause between shots. The quiet of people who had decided at some level, below conscious decision, that something different was happening, and they needed to pay attention to it. Reynolds checked his watch visibly. Whitmore did not. Sarah was still. Her breathing was regular, not controlled in the performative way of someone trying to demonstrate calm, but actually functionally quiet the breathing of someone who had reached a state where the body understood what was required of it without being told. 1 minute passed, then 2. Is she having second thoughts? Someone behind Webb said quietly. Blake turned and looked at whoever it was. Just looked. The person didn't say anything else. 3 minutes. The flags across the valley moved. Sarah's eyes tracked them. Not anxiously, not with urgency, with the quality of someone collecting data. At the firing line, the wind shifted 2 points north. Sarah noted it and continued watching. 700 meters out, the flag barely stirred. She stayed with it. 1,500 meters, the flag folded back toward its pole and then extended again in a different direction. She was reading a system, not a single wind, a wind system. The invisible river of moving air that ran from the firing line to the target and changed character 4 separate times along the way. Webb found himself holding his breath. Reynolds opened his mouth. Whitmore made a very small gesture with one hand that was not technically a command, but functioned entirely as one. Reynolds closed his mouth. The 4th minute, and then something happened to the flags. Not a pause, the wind never actually stopped out here. But there was a moment, approximately 11 seconds, where the patterns that had been competing with each other came into a kind of alignment. Not stillness, but coherence. A single system, moving with something close to consistency from the firing line to the target. Webb didn't see it immediately. Blake saw it at the same moment. Sarah's body made an adjustment so small it was almost invisible. A fractional shift of the support hand. A minute change in the position of her cheek against the stock. Her breathing slowed by 1 count. Then she was absolutely perfectly still. "My turn," she said. The words were barely audible, barely air, but in the silence of the range they carried. She pulled the trigger. The report hit them sharp and flat against the desert air, and then it was gone, and the bullet was somewhere in the 4,000 meters of space between the rifle and the target. and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about anything for the next 5.3 seconds. Nobody moved. Webb was counting without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The radio on the spotting team's table crackled. Impact confirmed. Still nobody moved. The spotter's voice came again, and this time it had a quality Webb had never heard in a range report before. A quality that was normally trained out of spotters because it introduced emotion where there was supposed to be only information. Direct center hit. I say again, direct center hit at 4,000 meters. The range stayed quiet for 3 full seconds after that. Then Marcus Webb said very quietly, "Holy God." Reynolds had both hands on the top of his head. Chief Blake had stood up from the equipment case. He was standing perfectly straight, not at attention, not deliberately military, just standing the way a man stands when he needs to absorb something into his body before his mind has finished processing it. Sarah unloaded the rifle. Her hands were steady. Her face showed nothing particular. She broke the action open, confirmed the chamber, and began the systematic process of making the weapon safe, and she did all of it with the unhurried efficiency of someone performing a familiar task. Whitmore walked toward her. He didn't stride. He walked, deliberately with the weight of a man who has had to absorb difficult information on many occasions and has learned to move toward it rather than away from it. He stopped 2 feet from her as she completed the safety procedure and stood. For a moment, he just looked at her. Then he looked at the rifle. Then back at her. "Commander Mitchell," he said. "Sir?" He paused. "Who are you?" She met his eyes. And for a fraction of a second, something moved behind hers. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something older than either of those things. Something that had been living in a quiet room for a long time and wasn't entirely sure yet whether it was safe to step into the light. "That's a longer answer than 5 minutes, sir," she said. Whitmore held her gaze. Around them, 28. Elite SEAL snipers stood in silence on the floor of the Nevada desert, and every one of them was trying to figure out the same thing the Admiral was. Who was this woman? What was she carrying? And why for 9 years had nobody known? Webb looked at the old rifle in her hands. The scratches on the case. The careful, personalized modifications. The way she had handled it like something she trusted absolutely. The way you only trust something you have taken into the most extreme situations and come back from. He thought about what she had said. You stop fighting and start listening. He had spent 2 years training to make shots nobody could make. He had been taught patience calculation mechanical discipline. He was by any reasonable measure an exceptional shooter. But in 4 minutes of watching her, he had understood something about what he was doing that 2 years of training had not given him. Something about the difference between solving a problem and becoming part of it. Something about the relationship between a person and a physical world that does not care about their skill or their reputation or how many hours they have put in. Something about listening. Blake walked over. He stopped beside Sarah and looked at the distant target for a moment. Then he extended his hand. Sarah looked at it. Then she shook it. Blake said, 20 years. I have been doing this for 20 years. He shook his head. That was the finest piece of work I have ever seen on a range. Sarah said, it was a good wind window. Blake looked at her with an expression that said very clearly that he knew exactly what she was doing and he respected it and he was not going to let her get away with it. You waited for the window, he said, knowing it would come. That's not luck. That's a different kind of seeing. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I had a teacher who said that, she finally said. That patience isn't passive. Patience is active listening. She glanced down at the rifle briefly. It took me a long time to understand what he meant. Who was he? Blake asked. She looked at the valley. Someone who believed I could do things before I believed it myself, she said. A long time ago, and something in the way she said it, the particular weight of it, the quality of memory, that isn't a comfortable memory, but is yours, that has shaped you in ways you couldn't have chosen and can't undo, told Blake that the story was much larger than what she was going to tell him right now. He looked at Whitmore. Whitmore was still watching Sarah with the expression of a man who has discovered in the middle of what he thought was a known equation an entirely new variable. The expression of a man who has decided that finding out the truth about that variable is more important than anything else currently on his schedule. Reynolds had moved off to one side. His face was not easy to read. There was the particular discomfort of a man who has been publicly professionally wrong, not maliciously, not through any failure of procedure, but simply through the specific blindness of someone who has spent long enough trusting what things look like that he has forgotten to ask what they are. Webb looked around the range. 27 other men, all of them trying in their own ways to recalibrate something that they had understood one way for their entire careers. The best shooter in the room had not been on the roster. She had been behind the observation rope. She had asked for 5 minutes, and they had almost not given them to her. And in that almost, Webb realized, lay a specific and uncomfortable lesson about the gap between what people assume and what people are. About the invisible weight that competence sometimes carries alone, uncelebrated, unrecognized, because the shape of it doesn't match what people have decided competence is supposed to look like. The desert sun was still burning. The flags across the valley moved in their complicated, multi-layered patterns. 4,000 meters away, a steel target held a single mark centered clean, impossible. Commander Sarah Mitchell stood on the firing line with an old rifle in her hands and said nothing more. And Admiral Daniel Whitmore stood 3 feet from her and understood with the certainty of long experience that the 5 minutes she had asked for had not been the beginning of a demonstration. They had been the first 5 minutes of an answer to a question he hadn't known he needed to ask. He turned to Reynolds. "Get me a secure room," he said. "Commander Mitchell and I have a conversation to begin." Reynolds didn't argue. He nodded and turned to handle it. Whitmore looked back at Sarah. "Whatever you carry, Commander," he said quietly, "you're going to share it with me. All of it." She looked at him steadily. The thing behind her eyes moved again. Older, heavier, real. "I'd like that, sir," she said. And for the first time since she had walked onto that range, something in her voice sounded like relief. The secure briefing room at Black Ridge had no windows. That was by design. Whatever happened inside those walls stayed inside those walls, and the people who built the facility understood that the most sensitive conversations were the ones that needed to be completely separated from the world outside. Whitmore sat across the table from Sarah Mitchell and said nothing for almost a full minute. He had learned through decades of extracting information from people who didn't entirely want to give it that silence was the most powerful tool in any room. Most people couldn't survive 30 seconds of it without filling the space. A minute of it produced confessions that 2 hours of questioning couldn't. Sarah sat with her hands folded on the table and waited him out. That told him something immediately. She had been trained by the same school of thought. She understood the silence as a tool, and she refused to be its victim. He put a folder on the table between them. Thin. Her official service record. 9 years of intelligence work performance reviews that described her as exceptional without specifying in what way, and an assignment history that moved her from posting to posting, with a regularity that, now that he was looking at it carefully, seemed slightly too deliberate to be administrative coincidence. "I've read this 4 times in the last 20 minutes, he said. "It tells me almost nothing useful." "No, sir," she agreed. "It wouldn't. Because the useful parts aren't in it." "No, sir." He leaned back. "How long have you been making shots at that distance?" She considered the question. Not because she didn't know the answer he could tell, but because she was deciding how much of the answer to give. "My confirmed record before today was 4,230 meters, she said. The room absorbed that. Whitmore kept his face neutral through an act of significant professional discipline. 4,200 meters. It was not only beyond anything the SEAL evaluation had attempted today. It was beyond anything in the publicly acknowledged record. The kind of number that existed, if it existed at all, in files that required a specific kind of clearance to access and a specific kind of authorization to even know about. "Where?" he asked. She met his eyes. "That information is classified above my ability to authorize sharing, sir. I have TS-SCI clearance." "I know. but the program that holds that record has a separate compartment designation. I'm not being obstructive, sir. I genuinely cannot authorize the disclosure. He studied her. But the record exists. In a file somewhere, she said. Yes, sir? He was quiet for a moment. Then, what program? She looked at him evenly. I need you to ask that question through the right channels, sir. When you do, I believe you'll find the file. And when you find it, I think you'll have questions that go considerably beyond what I did at 4,000 meters today. Reynolds knocked and entered without waiting, which was his usual operating procedure, and one Whitmore had never managed to fully break him of. He had a tablet in his hand, and an expression that suggested the last 20 minutes had done nothing to improve his afternoon. Sir, he set the tablet on the table. I ran a search on Mitchell's name through the standard databases. There's essentially nothing there that isn't in the file you already have. I know, Whitmore said. That's not normal. Even for intelligence officers, there's usually more administrative trace than this. Deployments, training records, equipment requisitions. He paused. It's like she materialized 9 years ago with a complete service record and no actual history. Sarah said without particular emphasis. That's because the history exists in a different system. Reynolds looked at her. Which system? The one you don't have access to, Colonel. Something moved across Reynolds's face. Not anger exactly. Something closer to the discomfort of a person who has spent their career believing they understand the architecture of the institution they work for, and is being shown in real time that there is an entire floor of that architecture they've never seen. He sat down. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Sarah said, I'll tell you what I can tell you. Some of it I'm cleared to share. Some of it I'm sharing because I've decided it's time, and the operational reasons for the silence no longer apply in the way they once did. She paused. Some of it I need you to verify through the right channels before I say it out loud in this room, because I won't be the one to breach a classification without authorization. But what I can give you today is enough to start. Whitmore nodded. She began. Not from the beginning. People who have carried a story for a long time rarely start at the beginning when they finally tell it. They start from the part that is still most alive in them, the part that hasn't quieted down no matter how many years have passed. She started from a mountain. She didn't name it. She gave coordinates in a format that Whitmore recognized as belonging to a specific theater of operations, and he made a mental note and kept his expression still. 4 years ago, she said. A SEAL element. 8 men had been compromised in a position they couldn't extract from without moving through an open corridor approximately 1,800 meters long. There was a fixed position covering that corridor. 1 shooter, good equipment, elevated angle. The element's options were to stay in place until the situation deteriorated past the point of recovery or to move and take casualties that the mission commander assessed as unacceptable. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. The request came through channels I won't name to a unit I'm not going to name. The tasking was for precision engagement on the fixed position. The complication was the angle, the distance, and the fact that the engagement window was going to open and close within approximately 90 seconds. 1 window. If the shot happened, the element could move. If it didn't, the operational picture became significantly worse. How far? Whitmore asked. The fixed position was 3,600 meters from my supporting position, Reynolds said quietly. That's not in any record I've ever seen. No, Sarah agreed. It wouldn't be. The element 8 men, Whitmore said. They made it out. All 8. The room was very quiet. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. He was recalibrating something visibly, the way an experienced man recalibrates when new information requires him to restructure an understanding he has held for a long time. The discomfort of it was real, but he was the kind of man who moved toward discomfort rather than away from it. Who sent you to that position? He asked. A program director I reported to at the time. Name. She held his gaze. That's one of the ones I need you to go through channels to verify, sir. I'll give you a reference number. It will get you to the right compartment. He nodded slowly. After the operation, what happened? And here something changed in her. Not dramatically. Not in a way that Reynolds watching her could probably have described afterward with precision. But Whitmore caught it. A particular quality of stillness that wasn't composure. That was something harder than composure. The stillness of a person who has made peace imperfectly and at great cost with something that was done to them. The operation created political complications, she said. The nature of the engagement, the location, the circumstances. There were aspects of it that certain people in certain positions did not want on record. The simplest solution was to ensure that the record didn't reflect what had actually happened. Reynolds said, they buried it. The mission was reclassified in a way that removed the precision engagement from the official account. The element reported a different extraction narrative. My role was removed from the file entirely. She paused. I was transferred within 30 days. My unit designation changed. My clearance profile was restructured in a way that made it practically impossible to connect my current assignment to my previous work. And you accepted that. Reynolds' voice had a quality in it that wasn't accusation. It was something closer to genuine bewilderment. Sarah looked at him steadily. What was the alternative, Colonel? He didn't answer. I could have refused the transfer. I could have made noise about what happened. And then what I had no documentation. The people who could verify the operation had career-level reasons to not verify it. The element I supported had been told a different version of their own rescue and had no reason to question it. She paused. I was 29 years old. I had no institutional backing and no leverage. The only thing I could do was accept the situation and continue serving. For 9 years, Whitmore said. I was still doing work that mattered, she said. The intelligence analysis, the data work. It wasn't what I had trained for, but it contributed to missions that protected people. I found a way to make it mean something. A brief pause. Most days, the last two words landed differently from the rest. Quieter. Truer. The admission of someone who has rehearsed a rational account of an irrational situation for so long that the rational account is mostly true, except for the parts that aren't, and the parts that aren't are the ones that wake you up at 4 in the morning. Reynolds was looking at the table. He had the expression of a man reassessing something he had said in a previous part of his day. Not a comfortable expression. Whitmore said, the evaluation today, the Black Ridge program, you knew about it. Yes, sir. Before the shooters failed. I knew the parameters of the evaluation when I was assigned to provide intelligence support 6 weeks ago. I knew the target distance. I knew the wind conditions this valley generates in summer. And you knew the shooters would fail. She was quiet for a moment. I thought it was likely they would encounter significant difficulty, sir. The conditions today were genuinely extreme for anyone. But not for you. I've shot in worse. Whitmore leaned forward. So why did you wait? You've been here for 6 weeks. You knew what the shot required. Why wait until 28 men had missed before you spoke up? The question hung in the room. Sarah looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up. Because nobody asked me, she said simply. And because I learned a long time ago that offering something before anyone is ready to receive it is the same as offering nothing. She paused. I'm an analyst. I'm support staff. I'm here to provide data packages and attend briefings. If I had walked up on day 1 and said I can make the shot, your evaluation is built around what would have happened. Reynolds made a small sound that acknowledged without stating that he knew exactly what would have happened. Because he was looking at what had happened when she tried it after 28 failures, and the initial response had still been a laugh and a dismissal. Today, the conditions were right, she continued. Not because the wind was favorable, the wind was exactly as complicated as it's been all week, but because the room was ready for a different answer. Because the question had been asked hard enough that people were actually listening for an answer instead of waiting to confirm what they already believed. Whitmore was quiet for a long time. Webb had been standing just outside the briefing room when the door opened briefly, and he had caught fragments not enough to construct the full story, but enough to understand the shape of it. Enough to understand that what had happened on the range today was not a surprise development. It was the visible tip of something much larger that had been sitting beneath the surface for years. He walked away from the door and found Chief Blake standing near the equipment area, going through the after-action checklist with the systematic thoroughness that was Blake's default state. "She's been holding something back," Webb said. Not a question. Blake didn't look up from the checklist. "Most people are holding something back. I mean something specific, something big." Blake set the clipboard down. He looked at the range. 4,000 meters of desert air, and at the far end of it, a target with a single centered mark. "You know what the hardest thing is about this discipline," he said. "Not the math, not the ballistics, not even the conditions." He looked at Webb. "The hardest thing is learning to see past what you're certain of, because the moment you're certain, you stop looking." Webb thought about that. "You knew," he said slowly, "when she came to the line. You knew she was different." "I suspected," Blake said. "There's a difference. I suspected because of the way she moved, the way she held the equipment. 20 years of watching shooters, you develop a sense for it. It's not magic, it's pattern recognition." He paused. "But knowing something is exceptional and understanding why it's exceptional are two separate problems. Do you know why now?" Blake picked up the clipboard again. "I know more than I did this morning, and less than I'll know tomorrow. That's how it usually goes." He paused. "But here's what I can tell you for certain. That woman didn't make that shot because she got lucky with a wind window. She made that shot because she understood something about patience that most shooters spend their entire career trying to learn and never fully get there." Webb looked at the briefing room door. "And someone buried that." Blake's jaw tightened slightly. "Apparently. For 9 years. Apparently." Webb shook his head slowly. "That's—" He stopped. "Yeah," Blake said without requiring him to finish. Inside the briefing room, Reynolds had asked to be excused 15 minutes in, and Whitmore had granted it, partly because the conversation had moved past the point where Reynolds' presence was adding anything useful, and partly because Reynolds clearly needed time to process what he was hearing. Whitmore had watched him leave and then turned back to Sarah. "The reference number," he said. "The one that gets me to the compartment." She recited it from memory. 12 digits and a letter code. She said it once evenly, and he wrote it down without repeating it back, because that was how you handled compartmented information in a room that wasn't formally secured for it. "How long will it take?" she asked. "To access the compartment a few days to route the request properly. Maybe a week if there's resistance." He studied her. "Is there likely to be resistance?" "There are people who would prefer the file stay buried," she said. "I don't know if any of them are still in positions where they can resist your request. Some of them have retired. Some have moved on." A pause. "Some of them may not want to become the story that comes out when the file opens." "That's not my problem to manage for them," Whitmore said. "No, sir," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her rifle case, which she had brought into the briefing room with her. "The shot today. At 3600 before today. There are others." "A few," she said carefully. "All in the same file. All in that theater." "Different theaters, same program." He sat with that for a moment. "The program had a name?" he asked. She looked at him directly and said nothing. "I understood." That was one of the things she couldn't give him without the formal authorization of accessing the compartment. He respected it. You either honored the system of classification or you didn't. And if you didn't, then the entire architecture of trust that made sensitive operations possible collapsed. She was protecting the system even while the system had failed to protect her, and he found that more revealing about her character than anything else she had told him. "Were you the only one?" he asked. Something passed through her expression. Brief. "No. There were others in the program. Several. What happened to them?" She was quiet for longer than she had been quiet since they sat down. "Some of them made the same kind of peace I made," she said at last. "Accepted the reassignment, moved on, continued serving in different capacities." She paused. "Some of them didn't handle it as well." He didn't press for specifics. The weight of what she was not saying was clear enough. "And your teacher," he said. "The one who said patience is active listening." She looked at him with an expression that acknowledged he had been paying careful attention. "What happened to him?" Whitmore asked. The stillness that came over her then was different from all the other stillnesses of the afternoon. This one had a specific gravity to it. The gravity of a loss that has been lived with long enough to become integrated, but never entirely quiet. "How was the program director?" she said. "He believed in what we were doing. He believed in all of us." She looked at the rifle case. "When the political situation developed after the operation, he fought the reclassification. He pushed back through every channel available to him." A pause. "He was retired at 12 months ahead of his scheduled date. Medical review. The documentation suggested early cognitive decline." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Was that documentation accurate?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "He was 54 years old and sharp as anyone I've ever worked with," she said flatly. "He could recite range data from engagements we had run 3 years earlier with perfect accuracy." She paused. "The last time I spoke to him was 2 weeks before his forced retirement. He told me to keep going. He told me to be patient." A breath. "He said that truth has a long flight time, but it always arrives." The room was completely silent. Whitmore looked at her, and for the first time since they had sat down, he allowed his professional composure to show a small fracture. Not much, just enough to be a human being for a moment instead of an admiral. "He was right," he said quietly. She looked at the table. Something moved in her face that she controlled but barely, and only because she had been controlling things for 9 years, and the muscle memory was deep. "Yes, sir," she said. "I know." Webb knocked before he entered, which Blake had probably coached him on. Whitmore told him to come in. "Sir?" Webb looked at Sarah, then back at Whitmore. "The spotting team found something." Whitmore straightened. "What kind of something?" "The impact mark." Webb paused. "The target has standard scoring rings 10 rings from the edge to center. The impact was in the exact geometric center of ring 10. Whitmore understood what that meant in terms of precision. The tolerance for an exact center hit at 4,000 meters was measured in fractions of a centimeter. Any deviation in any variable wind read. Atmospheric calculation. Trigger pull minute. Physiological movement. Any of it at all would have moved the impact off center. She hadn't just hit the target. She had hit the center of the center. Webb looked at her with an expression that wasn't hero worship. It was something more serious than that. The expression of someone who has had a fundamental assumption about the nature of excellence corrected in a way that will change how they approach their own work for the rest of their career. "Ma'am," he said, "can I ask you something?" Sarah looked at him. "After the shot, you didn't celebrate. You didn't, there was no reaction. Not really." He was working out how to say something that wasn't quite formed yet. Most people, when they do something that difficult, there's a moment of, I don't know. Release. Something. She was quiet. "Weren't you happy?" he asked. It was a genuine question. Unguarded. The kind that slips out before professional caution can stop it. She considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "I was glad the window came when it did," she said. "I was glad the read was right. She paused. Relieved, maybe, that the conversation could finally begin." "What conversation?" he asked. She looked at Whitmore. The one where the right people finally look at the right file," she said. "The one that should have happened years ago." Webb stood there absorbing that. Then Blake appeared in the doorway behind him. The veteran sniper had the same expression he'd been wearing since the shot. The expression of a man who has discovered that what he thought was the ceiling of what was possible was actually just the ceiling of what he'd been shown. "Sir," Blake said to Whitmore, "the rest of the team is asking questions I don't have answers to. They deserve something." Whitmore looked at Sarah. She gave a small nod. He stood. "Bring them in," he said. Blake stepped back. A moment later, the briefing room filled with the quiet, controlled movement of 28 SEAL snipers, arranging themselves in a space not quite built to hold them all. They were not crowding. They were giving each other the professional courtesy of room to stand, to breathe, to hold whatever they were carrying. Some of them looked at Sarah with curiosity. Some, with something harder to name, the particular expression of people reconsidering a judgment they had made quickly and publicly and would have to live with. Reynolds came back in. He took up a position at the back of the room and said nothing. Whitmore looked around at all of them. "What happened on this range today," he said, "is going to require a number of conversations with a number of people in the coming days. Some of those conversations are above the clearance level of most people in this room. What I can tell you is this." He paused. "The asset you watched perform this afternoon is not a surprise development. She is not an anomaly. She is the product of a program and a level of training that some of you didn't know existed because it was designed that way." He let that sit. "The full story will come out through proper channels, but I want you to hear from me directly right now that what you assumed about Commander Mitchell before she stepped to the firing lines today was wrong, and I want you to carry that lesson." He looked around the room. "Not because it's embarrassing that you were wrong," he said, "but because the assumption that kept you from seeing clearly the assumption about what exceptional looks like and where it comes from and who is allowed to carry it, that assumption is a vulnerability. In this work, vulnerabilities get people killed." The room was absolutely still. Whitmore looked at Sarah. She was looking at the floor, not in shame. In the complicated private territory of a person who has waited for something for a very long time and is now experiencing its arrival, and finding that the experience is not what they expected. Not triumph. Not vindication exactly. Something more complicated and more human than either of those things. Webb was the first one to do it. He straightened, squared his shoulders, and looked directly at her. "Ma'am," he said, "I apologize for what I said at the line." She looked up. He held her gaze. "You were right that 4,000 meters is a different problem. But so is judgment. And mine was wrong today." 27 other shooters were watching. Not performing. Actually watching. Waiting to see how she would answer. She looked at him for a long moment. "You were working with the information you had," she said. "So was I." A pause. "Now we have more. That's how it's supposed to work." Blake, standing near the wall, let out a slow breath. Outside, the desert was cooling toward evening. The flags across the valley were moving in their complicated, multi-layered patterns. The same wind system that had confounded 28 expert shooters, now moving through the space with total indifference to what had happened there. But something had changed in that space. Not the wind, not the distance, not the physics of the problem. Something about who was in the room to face it. Whitmore picked up the reference number he had written down and looked at it. 12 digits and a letter code. The address of a file that had been sitting quietly for 4 years in a compartment that most people didn't know existed, holding a story that had been carrying itself in silence for all that time. He thought about what Sarah had said, what her teacher had told her before he was forced out of the work he had dedicated his career to. Truth has a long flight time, but it always arrives. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket. Tomorrow, he would make the call. He would begin routing the authorization request. He would start pulling on the thread that he already understood, with the certainty of long experience, was attached to something much larger than a shooting evaluation in the Nevada desert. Tonight, he had one more question. He looked at Sarah. "The rifle," he said. "Your teacher, did he give it to you?" She looked at the case. For a moment, her face showed something that she didn't try to control. "He built it," she said. "For me. Specific to how I shoot." A pause. He said every shooter deserves a rifle that knows them as well as they know themselves. Whitmore nodded, and didn't ask anything more, because some things didn't need to be asked. They just needed to be understood. And in that room, at the end of a day that had begun as a standard evaluation and become something considerably more important. Whitmore understood enough. The rest would come. He would make sure of it. The authorization request took 4 days. Whitmore had expected resistance. What he got instead was silence, which was worse. Silence meant someone was deciding something. Silence meant the request had reached a level where people who had career-level reasons to keep a file closed were now aware that someone with sufficient rank was trying to open it. He sent the request on a Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, he had received exactly one response, a 3-line message from a deputy director at a level he didn't interact with, often informing him that the compartment he was attempting to access was under review, and that his request had been noted and would be processed in accordance with established procedure. He read it twice. Then he picked up the phone and called a number he had not used in 3 years. The man who answered was named Garrett. No rank given, no title used, which was itself a title of sorts. Garrett worked in a part of the intelligence community that didn't have a building you could visit or an organizational chart you could read. He was the kind of person that senior military officers occasionally needed and rarely acknowledged needing. "I sent an access request 4 days ago," Whitmore said. "Someone is sitting on it." "I heard," Garrett said. "You heard. These things travel, Admiral, especially when the compartment in question has been quiet for 4 years and suddenly someone with your rank is knocking on it." A pause. "Who showed you the reference number?" "That's not information I'm sharing." "Fair." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "The compartment exists. The people who built it are mostly retired. But retired doesn't mean uninvested. Some of them still have relationships with people who can slow things down. How long can they slow it down?" "Depends on how loud you want to be about this." Whitmore looked at the reference number written on the paper in his breast pocket. He had been carrying it for 4 days. "I want the file open by Friday," he said. Garrett made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's ambitious. I have 28 SEAL snipers sitting on a range evaluation that has been functionally invalidated by events, and I have a commander with a service record that doesn't reflect reality, and I have a program that apparently ran successful precision operations in at least 2 theaters and was then buried for political reasons." He paused. "Tell me what level of loud I need to be." "Give me 24 hours, Garrett said. He hung up. Whitmore set the phone down and looked across his desk. Sarah Mitchell's thin official file was still there beside a second folder, thicker assembled over the past 4 days from fragments he had been able to access through his own channels. Peripheral references. Training records from courses she had attended that didn't connect clearly to intelligence analysis work. A marksmanship certification from a program that had been administratively dissolved 7 years ago. An equipment requisition from 6 years ago for custom ballistic components that no desk-based analyst would ever need. The fragments of a story told sideways because the direct version had been removed. He had shown none of it to Reynolds. Reynolds had been quieter since the briefing room. Not subdued, Reynolds was not a subdued man by nature, but more careful, more deliberate. Whitmore had watched him interact with Sarah over the past 4 days and noticed that he had stopped talking about what she was and started asking questions about what she knew. That was progress of a sort. Sarah herself had returned to her normal duties with a composure that Whitmore found both admirable and faintly heartbreaking. She showed up to briefings. She prepared her data packages. She answered questions from the intelligence side of the evaluation with the same precise, unhurried competence she apparently brought to everything. And she waited. Not passively. Actively in the way she had described patient listening, not absence of engagement. On Thursday morning, Garrett called back. "The file opens at 1400 tomorrow," he said. "You'll have a secure terminal connection and a read authorization for yourself and up to 2 additional personnel. The originals stay in the compartment. You'll be reading a certified copy." What changed? The people who were sitting on it ran the math, Garrett said. Blocking an admiral's access request is manageable. Blocking it while someone at your level is making phone calls to people like me is a different calculation. The cost of the resistance was becoming higher than the cost of whatever the file contains. "Do you know what the file contains?" "Some of it," Garrett said. "Enough to tell you that you're not going to enjoy reading it." "I didn't expect to." "No," Garrett said. "But you should know the person who showed you the reference number. She has been carrying the weight of that file for 4 years, without institutional support, without acknowledgement, and without any indication that anyone was ever going to come looking." A pause. "Whatever is in it, she earned the right to have it read by the right person." Whitmore said, "That's why I'm reading it." He told Sarah that evening. Found her in the intelligence support office, which was small and functional and entirely without the personal touches that most people accumulated in a workspace over time. No photographs, no personal items. The workspace of someone who had learned not to make themselves at home in any particular place. She looked up when he came in. He said, "Tomorrow at 1400, I want you in the room." Something moved across her face. "Sir, the authorization covers up to 3 personnel. You are one of them." He held her gaze. "You should be there when it opens. You've earned the right to be in the room when the right people finally read what's in it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who is the third person?" "Blake," he said. "Because he's been in precision shooting programs for 20 years, and he'll understand the technical context better than anyone I could bring in from outside." She nodded. Something behind her eyes settled. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of someone who has been holding a weight alone for a long time, and has just been told that another set of hands is coming. "Sir," she said, "before tomorrow, there's something you should know that isn't in the file." He sat down across from her. "The 8 men," she said. "The element I supported 4 years ago. The ones I told you about." "The extraction operation," he said. "Yes," she paused. "I said I didn't know if they were aware of the real narrative, that what they had been told was a different version of their own rescue." She looked at her hands. "That wasn't entirely accurate." Whitmore waited. "One of them knew," she said. "The element leader. He was in a position where he could see enough of the surrounding situation to understand that the official account didn't reflect what had actually happened. He tried to correct the record. Through proper channels, twice." She paused. "He was told both times that his recollection of the events was unreliable. Post-mission stress. Standard language." Her voice was flat, not because she had no feeling about it, but because she had processed the feeling many times already, and what remained was the shape of it without the acute edge. He accepted the finding because refusing it had career implications he wasn't willing to absorb at that point in his service. "Who was he?" Whitmore asked. She met his eyes. "His name is Lieutenant Commander James Hooper. He retired 14 months ago. Medical separation back injury, legitimate sustained in a subsequent deployment." She paused. "He lives in Tucson now. He coaches youth soccer on weekends." Something in the specificity of that detail, youth soccer on weekends, landed with a particular weight. The picture of a man who had taken his exceptional capability, and his buried knowledge, and his unanswered questions, and found a quiet life to put them inside. "Does he know the file is being opened?" Whitmore asked. "He doesn't know I'm here," she said. "We lost contact after his second attempt to correct the record. I thought it was safer for him if we weren't connected." Whitmore studied her. "You protected him." "I tried to. Even though he was the one person who could have corroborated your account." "Yes." He let that sit for a moment. The particular integrity of it, the choice to protect someone else's career, at the cost of her own corroboration, was the kind of thing that didn't make strategic sense and made complete human sense. And it told him more about who Sarah Mitchell was than anything in the file he hadn't read yet. "After tomorrow," he said. "I'll want to speak with him." "Yes, sir," she said. "I think he'll want to speak with you too." The next afternoon, the secure terminal connection opened at exactly 1400. Whitmore, Sarah, and Blake were in a room that had been swept and sealed, and the screen in front of them populated with a certified copy of a file that bore a classification designation. None of them said aloud, and a program name that Blake mouthed silently, and then sat back in his chair, with an expression that said he had heard of it in the way you hear of things that exist at the edge of what is officially acknowledged. Whitmore read. He was a fast reader, discipline trained to absorb operational documentation efficiently. But he slowed down 3 times, once at the list of operations, once at the performance assessments, and once for a long time at a section near the end that neither Blake nor Sarah could see from their angle, but that made him set the document down briefly and look at the wall. Blake was reading the technical sections. His jaw had been tight for 10 minutes. At one point he said quietly, and to no one in particular, "This is real." Not a question. The statement of someone who had spent a career in precision shooting and was reading performance data that he understood at the technical level to be genuine. Not inflated. Not the product of controlled conditions. Real-world results from real-world conditions in real-world scenarios. Sarah was reading her own history. That was the most complicated thing to watch. Whitmore glanced at her several times and saw the expression of someone reading an account of themselves, written by people who understood what she had done and documented it with precision, and then put it somewhere nobody would look. The expression of someone finding proof that they had not imagined it. That it had happened, and it had been real, and it had been exactly as significant as they had known it to be, even while the world around them treated them as someone who organized files. 40 minutes into the reading, Blake looked up. "The program director," he said. "Halverson." He was looking at the file. "I know that name." Whitmore looked at him. "Not personally," Blake said quickly. "But in the shooting community, long-range precision specifically, there are names that circulate. People who built something significant and then disappeared from the scene." He paused. "Halvorsen was talked about maybe 8-9 years ago, developing something, a training methodology, something different." He shook his head slightly. "Then he just wasn't there anymore. Nobody knew what happened. Most people assumed he'd moved into deeper classification work and couldn't talk about it." "I was pushed out," Sarah said. Her voice was even. "He spent the last years before his forced retirement doing contract consulting for a private firm. Ballistics modeling. He was good at it. He kept working." A pause. "He had a stroke 18 months ago. He's partially recovered. He lives with his daughter in Portland." The room was very still. Blake looked at her. "You've stayed in contact with him?" "I check in," she said simply. "Every few months. He doesn't know about today. He doesn't know I'm here or what's happening." She paused. "He spent 5 years building something genuine and real that helped people come home who otherwise wouldn't have, and then he was told it had never existed. The least I can do is make sure someone remembers to call." Blake looked like he was having a physical reaction to that information. Not emotional in an obvious way. Blake was not an obviously emotional man, but something was happening in his face that had to do with the fact that he had been in this discipline for 20 years and had known or thought he had known its major figures and its significant developments, and was now discovering that one of the most important figures in its recent history had been erased from the record he thought he understood. "He should know," Blake said. "What's happening today? He should know the file is open." Whitmore looked at Sarah. She was quiet for a moment. "After this meeting," she said, "I'll call him." They returned to the file. The section that had made Whitmore set the document down was a personnel assessment dated 4 years ago, 3 weeks before Sarah's transfer. It was written by Halverson and addressed to the Program Oversight Committee. It was formal in language and devastating in content, a clear, documented, precisely argued case that the reclassification of the extraction operation was both factually incorrect and a significant injustice to the personnel involved. It named Sarah specifically. It named her performance. It described in clinical and precise language what she had accomplished and what it had meant for the 8 men who had come home because of it. And at the bottom in the response section was a 1-paragraph reply from the Oversight Committee noting that the assessment had been received, reviewed, and would be retained in the file, and that no further action was warranted at this time. They had read it. They had documented that they read it. They had filed it away and left her behind the observation rope. Whitmore closed the file. He sat for a moment. Then he looked at Sarah. She was looking at the screen at the last page of the file at Halverson's assessment and the committee's 1 paragraph in response, and her expression was doing something complicated. Not tears, not anger. Something that was a long time past both of those things, and had arrived at a place that was harder to name, the expression of someone who has known the truth and lived with no one else knowing it, and is now sitting in a room where the right people finally know and is trying to understand what that changes and what it doesn't. 4 years, Blake said quietly. Nobody answered. There wasn't an answer that was adequate. Whitmore stood. I'm calling the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations this afternoon. Today. He picked up the certified copy protocol sheet. This file is being transferred to an active review. The reclassification is going to be examined. The personnel record correction process is going to begin. Sarah looked at him. That could take longer than it should, yes, he said. But it's beginning today, with my name on it. He paused. And Halverson's assessment is going in as primary documentation. His name goes back on this. Something moved in Sarah's face, swift and deep, and she controlled it but not entirely, and not immediately. Blake was already on his feet. He had the look of a man who had absorbed a significant quantity of difficult information and was now engaged in the process of deciding what to do with it, which for Blake meant doing something productive with it immediately, because stillness at moments like this was its own kind of unbearable. "The evaluation," he said to Whitmore. "The Black Ridge program. What happens to it now?" "The evaluation results stand," Whitmore said. "All of them, including today's." He looked at the data from the shot is going into the program record with full attribution. Blake nodded. Then he said something that was not entirely a question. "The shooting community. The people in this discipline who should know what Halverson built, what she's done." He paused. "That doesn't stay in a classified file forever." "No," Whitmore said. "It doesn't." Blake looked at Sarah. And for a moment, he was simply a man who had spent 2 decades in a discipline and understood exactly what she represented within it and what it meant that she had been invisible within it for 9 years. "You're the best I've ever seen," he said. "Not flattery. A technical assessment from someone qualified to make it. And I've seen everyone." She looked at him steadily. "Halverson taught me." "He taught you what he knew," Blake said. "What you did with it, that part is yours." She didn't answer that. But she didn't look away either. Webb was waiting outside when they came out of the secured room. He had no official reason to be there, which meant he had been there on his own time, which meant he had been thinking about something he wanted to say and had decided that waiting was better than not saying it. He looked at Whitmore, then at Sarah. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to ask you something, professionally." She waited. "The shot, the 4,000 meters." He was precise, choosing his words carefully in the way of someone who is asking a real question rather than making conversation. "You said you waited for the wind window, that you read the system rather than fighting it." He paused. "I've been thinking about that for 4 days. About what that means for how I've been training, how I've been approaching the discipline." Another pause. "Would you be willing to talk through it, not just the mechanics, the way you think about it?" Sarah looked at him, then at Blake. Blake made a very small gesture that communicated without words that this was a good development and she should pursue it. "When?" she said. "Now if you have time," Webb said. "Or whenever you're available." She glanced at Whitmore, who said, "Your support assignment doesn't require your presence this afternoon." She looked back at Webb. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile exactly, but its underlying movement. The expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is discovering that putting it down doesn't mean losing it. That the knowledge doesn't diminish when it gets shared. It becomes something else, something that can be passed on. "The range," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." Webb nodded and moved off. Whitmore watched him go. Then he looked at Sarah. "Before you go," he said, "the phone call to Halverson." He paused. "Tell him I'd like to speak with him when he's ready. Not formally, not procedurally. Just 2 people having a conversation about something that matters." She understood what he was really saying. That he wasn't going to let this become a process that processed its way into abstraction. That the man who had built the program, who had fought for the record, and lost, who was living with his daughter in Portland, recovering from a stroke at 61 years old, that man was going to hear a human voice telling him that someone had found what he'd built and understood what it was worth. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'll tell him." She picked up the rifle case and walked toward the range. Whitmore watched her go. Then he turned back to the secured room and began making phone calls. Blake stayed with him for the first call, sitting across from him, with the file summary open on his knee, ready to speak to the technical specifications if the conversation required it. He had the expression of a man who has had a long, good career and has just discovered that his map of the territory he thought he knew was missing significant geography. It was uncomfortable. It was also, he understood, exactly the right kind of discomfort. The kind that produces revision rather than resistance. On the range, Sarah set up at the same firing position she had used 4 days ago. Webb settled in beside her with a notebook, which she glanced at briefly and did not comment on. "You don't need to write it down," she said. You need to feel it. He set the notebook aside. Okay, he said. Tell me where to start. She looked at the flags across the valley. The same complicated multi-layered wind system that had beaten 28 shooters and given her a 90-second window of coherence. Start with what you know, she said. Not what you've been taught to know. What you actually genuinely know from being here right now paying attention. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The wind near the line is coming east-northeast, about 6 knots. The flag at 700 is barely moving. Keep going. The one at 1500 is moving in a different direction entirely. And what does that tell you? He thought about it. That there isn't one wind, there's a system. And the system? He was quiet longer this time. She let the silence work. The system has a rhythm, he said slowly. It's not random. It's shifting but in a pattern. Like there's an underlying movement and the variations are on top of it. She looked at him. Yes, she said. And the way she said it, not performing approval, just confirming, told him he had found the beginning of something real. They stayed on the range for 3 hours. In the briefing building, Whitmore made 4 phone calls and sent 2 formal communications upward through channels that would require responses. Reynolds, who had been quietly efficient all afternoon, appeared at the door of the briefing room with a summary of the administrative steps required for the personnel record review process and a question about whether Whitmore wanted him to begin coordinating with the relevant records offices. Whitmore looked at him. Yes, he said. I want it started today. Reynolds nodded. He turned to go. Then he stopped. Sir? He turned back. There was something in his face that was different from the clipped efficiency of the past hour. Something that belonged to the man rather than the officer. The things I said to her at the line, the first day. She's not looking for an apology, Victor, Whitmore said quietly. I know, Reynolds said. But I am. He paused. 23 years of process. And I still made the same assumption everyone makes. He shook his head. That should matter to me, and it does. Whitmore studied him for a moment. Put the energy into the record review, he said. That's the apology that means something. Reynolds held his gaze. Then he nodded once and left. Whitmore sat alone for a moment. I thought about a woman who had spent 9 years being invisible in the institution she had served exceptionally. Who had carried a program director's last words. Truth has a long flight time, but it always arrives, and had made them the load-bearing structure of nearly a decade of patient active waiting. Who had shown up at a range in the Nevada desert and asked for 5 minutes and changed the entire shape of what was understood to be possible. I thought about an old rifle built by a man who believed every shooter deserved a rifle that knew them as well as they knew themselves. He thought about what it meant that the rifle was still working. Then he picked up the phone and made the 5th call. The call to Halverson happened that same evening. Sarah sat in her quarters with the phone in her hand for 3 full minutes before she dialed. Not because she was uncertain, because she was preparing herself for the version of him she might find on the other end. The version that 18 months of recovery had produced the voice that might be slower or smaller than the one she remembered. The one that had said, "Patience is active listening," with the particular authority of someone who had built that understanding through years of actual practice. She dialed. His daughter answered. Young woman, early 30s, the same brisk efficiency in her voice that Sarah had noticed the 2 times she'd spoken with her before. She said her father was awake and would want to take the call, and a moment later there was the soft sound of a phone being transferred. "Mitchell," he said. Not a question. His voice was slower than it had been. The stroke had taken something from the left side of his face, his daughter had told her, and it had affected his speech in ways that therapy had partially corrected. But the quality of the voice, the quality that had nothing to do with speed or articulation, and everything to do with the person behind it, that was entirely intact. "Sir," she said. "Something happened," he said. She had never been able to get ahead of him. Not in 5 years of working for him. Not now. "Yes, sir?" "Tell me." So she told him. All of it. The evaluation, the 28 shooters, the 5 minutes the shot. The briefing room. Whitmore's authorization request. The file opening. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes without significant interruption, and he listened, the way he had always listened, completely, without rushing her, without inserting himself into the narrative before it was ready for him. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then he said, the center of the ring. Of everything she had told him, that was what he focused on first. Yes, sir, she said. That's what the spotter reported. Another silence, and then he made a sound that she recognized after a moment as a laugh. Quiet, brief, the laugh of someone who has been given something they weren't expecting and isn't quite sure what to do with the feeling it produces. I told you the rifle knew its job, he said. You told me a lot of things, she said. Most of them turned out to be right. Most of them. Something warm in that. The particular warmth of a teacher who doesn't need a student to grant them perfect accuracy, just honesty. What did I get wrong? She thought about it seriously, the way he would want her to. You told me the institutional memory would be shorter than I expected, that once people moved on, the story would surface on its own. And it didn't. It needed help. He was quiet for a moment. You gave it help. Someone gave me the room, she said. Whitmore. He was ready to hear it. You found the wind window, Halverson said. She smiled, and even though he couldn't see it, something in the quality of her silence communicated it. He wants to speak with you, she said. Whitmore, not formally. He said just two people having a conversation about something that matters. The silence that followed was different from the other silences. Fuller. The silence of someone receiving something they had stopped expecting to receive. He read the assessment, Halverson said finally. He read everything. So did Blake. Chief Aaron Blake, senior precision shooting instructor, 20 years in the discipline. He knew your name. He said you were talked about in the community before you disappeared from it. A long pause. Talked about, as someone who built something significant. She paused. He was right. Halverson didn't answer that immediately. When he did, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him in a long time. Not grief exactly. Something that was on the far side of grief, where you go when you've spent enough time with it, that it no longer defines the landscape, but is simply part of it. The 8 men, he said. They should know. Hooper already knows, she said. At some level. Whitmore is going to contact him. Not just Hooper, all of them. A pause. They came home, Mitchell. They have a right to know the full account of how. I know, she said. That's part of what the record review will establish. He was quiet again. Then, how are you not the file? Not the shot. You. She looked at her hands. The rifle case was on the floor beside her bed where it always was. She had slept near it for years, not as a weapon, not as equipment, but as the physical object most associated with the person she actually was, rather than the person her reassigned record said she was. I'm tired, she said. And I'm okay. Both of those things are true at the same time. Yes, he said. That's how it usually feels, when the waiting is over. She stayed on the phone with him for another 30 minutes. They talked about small things, his recovery, the physical therapy, the grandchildren. His daughter was starting to discuss wanting someday. Normal human things that existed alongside the extraordinary weight of the larger story and were not diminished by it. At the end, he told her to sleep well, and she told him she would try. She set the phone down and sat in the quiet. Then she lay back and for the first time in 4 days fell asleep before midnight. Whitmore called James Hooper on Friday morning. He had thought carefully about how to begin that conversation. Hooper was a private citizen now. 14 months out of service. Back injury. Legitimate separation. Building a civilian life in Tucson that had its own structure and its own value. He had tried twice through official channels to correct a record and been told both times that his recollection was unreliable. Walking back into that was not something a reasonable person would do without significant cause. Whitmore identified himself, gave his rank and current position, and then said, I've read the file. Silence on the other end. The real file, Whitmore said. The compartmented one. The one that has the correct account of what happened. Another silence. Longer. How? Hooper said. One word. Not a question about the mechanics. A question about whether this was actually happening. Someone showed me the reference number, Whitmore said. Someone who has been waiting a long time for the right person to use it. He heard Hooper's breathing change. Mitchell, Hooper said. She didn't tell you she was here. We lost contact. I thought she'd... He stopped. She protected me. She thought staying away would protect me. It may have, Whitmore said. The people who reclassified the operation were not gentle with the people who pushed back. You know that. I was told my memory of my own mission was unreliable, Hooper said, and something in his voice, controlled and level, and absolutely devastating, communicated what 4 years of carrying that had cost him. I was in that position. I saw what happened. I knew what saved us, and I was told that my account of it was a product of stress. I know, Whitmore said. The men in my element. His voice had tightened. Some of them have asked me, over the years. The extraction didn't fully add up for them either, but the official account was, it was plausible. I let it stand because the alternative was fighting a wall I'd already hit twice. He paused. I've been carrying that. Then let me carry some of it now, Whitmore said simply. The record review has begun. Your element's extraction is going into the official history with the correct account. That means Mitchell's name goes in, her role goes in, what she did goes in. He paused. And your original reports, the ones that were dismissed, are going in as documentation of the reclassification process. Hooper was quiet for so long that Whitmore almost spoke again. Then, can I ask you something, Admiral? Yes. The shot she made, whatever prompted this, was it the Black Ridge evaluation? Yes. She made the shot. She did. Another pause. At what distance? 4,000 meters, Whitmore said. Direct center hit. 28 SEAL snipers had attempted it before she asked to try. The sound Hooper made was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was entirely the sound of someone who has believed something strongly in the face of institutional contradiction for 4 years, and has just been handed evidence that the thing they believed was true. She's the best I've ever seen, he said. His voice had cracked very slightly on the last word, and he didn't try to hide it. In that position, at that distance, in those conditions, if you knew what she was working with, the angle, the environmental factors. He stopped. There was no one else who could have done it. I knew that then. I know it now. I know it too, Whitmore said. That's why her name goes in the record, permanently and correctly. He let Hooper have a moment. Then he said, She told me you might be willing to speak with the element, the full account, from you. A long pause. They deserve to know. Yes. Set it up, Hooper said. Whatever format makes sense, I'll be there. When Whitmore arrived at the range that afternoon, something had shifted in the atmosphere of Black Ridge that was difficult to quantify precisely, but impossible to miss. The evaluation had been technically suspended, pending the administrative review, which meant the 28 SEAL snipers were in a holding pattern, not dismissed, not yet reassigned, occupying the particular professional limbo of people waiting for institutional machinery to complete its work. What they were actually doing was spending time with Sarah Mitchell. Not formally. Not as any kind of organized activity. But Webb had started something the day before on the range, and it had spread the way. Things spread in small professional communities where people are paying attention. One conversation observed by 2 others who started their own conversation, which drew in 3 more. By Friday afternoon, there were 11 shooters on and around the range with Sarah, and what was happening looked from a distance like a training session, but from closer was something more complicated than that. It was a conversation about seeing. About the gap between what people are trained to perceive and what is actually there when the training assumptions are stripped away. Blake was in the middle of it, not as a student. He was too senior and too experienced for that framing to be accurate, but as someone who had recognized a peer. An equal in the discipline. Someone whose depth in it matched his own from a different angle, and the collision of those 2 angles was producing something genuinely new. Reynolds was watching from a distance. He had been watching for 2 days in the particular way of a man who has undergone a significant revision of something he believed and is now in the uncomfortable process of rebuilding the structure. He walked up beside Whitmore. "The program review," he said. "I spoke with records this morning. The administrative pathway for correcting the service record is going to take approximately 4 months. Standard processing timeline. Can it be expedited?" "I've already submitted the request," Reynolds said. "With your authorization, if approved, we're looking at 6 to 8 weeks. Whitmore nodded. "Push it." Reynolds was quiet for a moment, both of them watching Sarah work through something with a young shooter who had asked a question about reading atmospheric layers. Her hands were still. She didn't gesture when she explained a habit of someone who learned to communicate through precision rather than expression. And the shooter was listening with the full attention of someone who has understood that they are receiving something real. "I've been thinking about what she said," Reynolds said. "In the briefing room, about why she waited, that the room wasn't ready for a different answer until it had asked the question hard enough." Whitmore said nothing. He let Reynolds find his way to wherever he was going. "I've been in this role for 11 years, Reynolds said. "Training officer, evaluation coordinator. I've watched a lot of people come through this range." A pause. "I don't know how many times I've been the reason someone didn't get the 5 minutes." It was a statement that cost him something to say. Whitmore could hear the cost in it. "You can't recover the ones you didn't see," Whitmore said. "You can only change how you look from here." Reynolds turned that over. "That's a more generous framing than I deserve." "It's an accurate one," Whitmore said. "Generous would be pretending it doesn't matter. It matters. But the question is what you do with that." Reynolds looked at the range. "I'm putting together a proposal. A modified evaluation protocol for future precision programs. Something that separates assignment category from participation eligibility at the assessment level." He paused. "No one is assumed incapable because of where they've been assigned." Whitmore looked at him. "She's not the only one," Reynolds said quietly. "That's what I keep coming back to. She's the one we saw. How many others have we missed because the evaluation didn't make room for the possibility?" It was the right question. Whitmore had been carrying a version of it himself since the day of the shot. The specific discomfort of institutional responsibility, not personal fault, but systemic contribution. The way good people operating inside structures that have unexamined assumptions perpetuate outcomes that none of them individually would choose. "Put the proposal together," he said. "Send it to me when it's ready." Reynolds nodded. "Yes, sir. On the range." Sarah had shifted from the atmospheric discussion to something else. The young shooter had asked a question that Whitmore couldn't hear from this distance, but whatever it was had produced a pause from her. Not a hesitation, but the pause of someone deciding how much of the real answer to give. Then she said something that made the shooter go very still. Whitmore walked closer. "The fear," she was saying. "That's what nobody tells you. Not fear of missing. Fear of what happens if you don't miss. Because once you make the shot, everything changes. People know what you can do. And knowing what you can do means they'll ask you to do it again." She looked at the rifle in his hands. And again. And again. Until the thing you're capable of becomes the thing that defines you, and you stop being a person and become a function. The shooter. His name was Carver. One of the younger members of the team looked at her with the expression of someone hearing something they didn't know they needed to hear. "Is that what happened to you?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "It was starting to," she said. "And then the situation changed in a different way, and I became invisible instead, which was its own kind of problem." A pause. "But at least when you're invisible, you get to be a person inside the invisibility." Carver thought about that. "How do you protect it, that the person inside?" She looked at him seriously. "You protect it the same way you protect any long-range asset. You don't expose it unnecessarily. You don't let every situation demand everything from it. You choose your moments." She paused. "And you find the people who know what it is and can be trusted with it. Even if there are only 2 or 3 of them. Even if it takes years." Carver nodded slowly. "Halverson," he said. He had been in the room when Blake mentioned the name, apparently. Your program director. He was one of them. He was the first one, she said. The one who said this is real, this is genuine, and it deserves to be developed rather than hidden. A pause. That kind of person is rare. When you find them, you hold on. Blake appeared beside Whitmore. He had drifted away from the group and now stood beside the Admiral with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who has been processing something large. She's teaching them, he said quietly. Not a complaint. A statement of something he was watching with a quality that was close to reverence. Yes, Whitmore agreed. Not just the technical work, the framework, how to think about it. He shook his head slightly. She's been holding this for 9 years, and she's just giving it away. That's what it's for, Whitmore said. Blake was quiet for a moment. Halverson built a program that was supposed to do this. Train people, develop the methodology, expand it. He paused. It got buried. But the thing he built in her that didn't get buried, she's been carrying it all this time. Whitmore looked at Sarah. She had moved on from the conversation with Carver and was now standing with Webb, who had a notebook again. He apparently couldn't help himself, and she was not telling him to put it away this time. She was watching him write something, and there was an expression on her face that was the cleanest thing Whitmore had seen all week. Not complicated, not layered, just present. The expression of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing after a very long time of being somewhere else entirely. The twist came on Saturday morning, and like the best of them, it arrived quietly through a phone call dressed as administrative information. Whitmore was in his office when his aide knocked and entered with the expression of someone who has received information they don't entirely know how to categorize. Sir, he said, there's a call from Washington, deputy director level. Not the deputy director who had sent the 3-line delay response the previous week. A different one. Higher. Whitmore picked up. The voice on the other end was measured and precise, and absolutely without warmth in the way of someone who has learned to conduct difficult conversations at operational temperature. He introduced himself. Whitmore knew the name. Everyone at his level knew the name. Admiral, the deputy director said. I'm calling about the compartment access you initiated earlier this week. I assumed you might, Whitmore said. The file review you've initiated has brought some attention to the circumstances surrounding the original reclassification, specifically to the individuals who authorized it. That was my intention, Whitmore said. A brief pause. 2 of those individuals are currently serving in advisory capacities that would be significantly affected by a formal review finding. Another pause. I want to be direct with you, Admiral. There will be institutional pressure against the full scope of what you appear to be initiating. I'm aware of that. And you intend to proceed. I intend to proceed, Whitmore said. The deputy director was quiet for several seconds. Then, good. Whitmore had not expected that. The reclassification was wrong, the deputy director said. I've known it was wrong for 3 years. I didn't have sufficient access to the underlying file to act on it formally, and the compartment structure made it difficult to get there without the kind of authorization chain that requires someone at your level to initiate. A pause. You've opened the door. I intend to walk through it with you. The shape of what Whitmore was hearing reconfigured itself rapidly. The resistance, the 3-line delay response. The silence had not been uniformly defensive. Some of it had been, but some of it had been the institutional machinery doing what institutional machinery always does, which is to slow things down while the people who actually control the outcome make their decisions. The decision at the relevant level had been made. The individuals who authorized the reclassification, Whitmore said carefully. What happens to them? That depends on what the formal review finds, the deputy director said. I won't prejudice the outcome, but I can tell you that the assessment authored by the program director Halverson is going to be treated as what it is, a documented record of institutional misconduct. A pause. And the personnel record correction you've initiated for Commander Mitchell is going to be fully supported at my level. Whitmore set the phone down 20 minutes later and sat very still for a moment. Then he walked to the range. Sarah was there alone this time. The morning session with the team hadn't started yet. She was sitting on an equipment case with a cup of coffee, doing nothing in particular, which for her, Whitmore had come to understand, was itself a form of preparation. The active listening that didn't require a specific object to be directed at. She looked up when she heard him coming. Something in his expression told her immediately that something significant had happened. "Washington called," he said. She waited. "The review is fully supported at the deputy director level. The personnel correction proceeds. The reclassification is going to formal review." He paused. "And the individuals who authorized it are going to answer for it." She was very still. "The full record," he continued. "Your name, Halverson's assessment, the correct account of the extraction. All of it enters the permanent record with full institutional acknowledgement." She looked away from him toward the valley. The flags were moving in the morning air. The same wind system, the same complicated layers, the same desert that had been indifferent to everything that had happened here over the past week, and would remain indifferent for years after they had all left. When she looked back, her face had done something she hadn't planned for it to do. Something she didn't immediately control. Not tears or not quite. Something underneath tears, the thing that happens when the body has held a posture of strength for so long that the first moment of actual safety produces a kind of structural release. A brief, visible trembling in the set of her jaw. Here and then gone quickly. She breathed. "Halvorsen," she said. Her voice was steady. "He needs to hear this from you, not from me. I'm calling him this afternoon." She nodded. Then she said very quietly, "He said truth has a long flight time, but it always arrives." "He was right," Whitmore said. She looked at the rifle case beside her. The old, scratched, rebuilt case with the worn latches and the history nobody had asked to hear. "He built that rifle for a 19-year-old who didn't know yet what she was capable of," she said. "He said every shooter deserves a rifle that knows them as well as they know themselves." She was quiet for a moment. "I think he meant every person deserves someone who sees what they're capable of before they've proven it. Who builds toward that possibility without requiring the proof first." Whitmore looked at the case. "He was describing himself," he said. She glanced at him. "What he did for you," Whitmore said. "What a good teacher does. They build toward the possibility. They don't require the proof first." She was quiet for a long time. The morning air moved around them. The flags across the valley shifted in their patterns. "I want to rebuild the program," she said finally. Not a request. The statement of someone who has thought about something for a long time and has identified the moment when it can finally be said out loud. Not exactly as it was, but what it was trying to do, the methodology, the approach to precision training, the framework Halvorsen built. She paused. "There are people in this discipline who need what he developed. Not just one unit, not just one evaluation, properly with the right institutional structure behind it." Whitmore looked at her. "Halvorsen's daughter told me he still writes," she said. "Not operationally, but the methodology, the framework. He's been writing it down," she said, "because he didn't want it to disappear when he did." A pause. "It didn't disappear. It's been sitting in Portland, and in this range, and in an old rifle case for 9 years, waiting for someone to build the right structure around it." "You're describing a formal program proposal," Whitmore said. "Yes, sir. That requires institutional support, budget authorization, curriculum review." "I know what it requires," she said. "I've been doing this long enough to know what it requires." She met his eyes. "I'm asking if you'll back it." The moment had a particular weight to it. The weight of something that has been in process for a long time, arriving at the point where the next step is irreversible. Not dangerous, right? The particular weight of a right thing. "Write the proposal," he said. "Bring Halvorsen's framework into it. I'll back it." She nodded. She picked up her coffee and looked at the range. Behind them, the sound of footsteps on the path. Webb and Carver arriving for the morning session, talking about something in the low-focused way of people who have been thinking about a problem since they woke up. Behind them, Blake, who spotted Whitmore and altered course slightly without breaking stride. The day was beginning. And for the first time in 4 years, Sarah Mitchell knew exactly where she was standing and exactly what she was building toward. The rifle case sat on the ground beside her. The flags moved in their complicated, beautiful, indifferent patterns across the desert valley. And somewhere in Portland, an old man who had built something extraordinary and lost it to institutional politics and refused to let the knowledge die, was writing it down in careful, precise longhand, because he had always believed that truth has a long flight time, but it always arrives. He had been right. It had. The proposal took 11 days to write. Sarah worked on it every morning before the range sessions began, and every evening after they ended, building the framework from 2 sources: her own 9 years of carrying Halverson's methodology inside a different job, and the handwritten documents his daughter scanned and emailed in 12 separate batches over the course of a week. The scans were not clean. Halverson's handwriting had changed since the stroke, the letters slightly irregular on the left side where his hand hadn't fully recovered. But the thinking behind them was as precise and structured as anything Sarah had read in 2 decades of technical documentation. He had been writing it down for 3 years. Not because anyone asked him to, not because he believed anyone would ever read it, because he could not let it disappear. When the final batch of scans arrived, Sarah sat with them for a long time before she opened the files. She knew what they would contain. She had learned the methodology from the inside, from years of being trained inside it and then carrying it alone. But reading it in his handwriting, seeing the way he had reconstructed the entire framework from memory after the program was buried, understanding the discipline that required, that was different from knowing it abstractly. She opened the files. The first page was dated 14 months after his forced retirement. At the top, in handwriting that was still steady. At that point, he had written a single line before the technical content began. "For whoever finds this, build it right this time." She sat with that for a while. Then she kept reading. Webb knocked on her door on the 8th day. He had a question about atmospheric layering that had come out of a session earlier, something he'd been working through in his own practice and couldn't resolve. She answered it in 6 minutes precisely and completely. And when she finished, he stood there for a moment with the notebook he always brought and the expression of someone who has a second question that is harder to ask than the first. "The program," he said. "The proposal you're writing. Is there a component that involves training people who are already in service, not just new recruits or a specialized unit?" She looked at him. "That's the central component." He shifted his weight slightly. "Because there are people in my element, and in other elements, who have been doing this for years, and who are, I think they've been doing it the way I was doing it, the way 28 of us were doing it last week." He paused. Before. She understood what before meant. Before the shot. Before the 5 minutes. Before the room was ready for a different answer. "The proposal includes a retrofit curriculum," she said, "for active duty personnel at various experience levels. The methodology works differently depending on where someone is in their development, but it's applicable at every stage." She paused. "It worked on you." He looked slightly startled. "We've only been working together for a week." "A week of active listening is worth considerably more than a year of active not listening," she said. "You made real movement. I saw it." He absorbed that quietly. Then he said, "I want to be part of it. Whatever the program becomes. I want to contribute to it, formally if that's possible." She looked at him steadily. He was 26 years old, and he had approached the range at the start of the week with assumptions that had been cleanly and permanently corrected by the end of it. That was not nothing. In fact, in Sarah's experience, the capacity to have your assumptions corrected without defensiveness, to absorb the correction and move forward, rather than retreating into the position you started in, was rarer and more valuable than almost any technical skill. "Write it down," she said. "Your experience of this week. Not technically. What it felt like to think about the discipline differently. What changed in how you see it." She paused. "That's the kind of testimony the proposal needs alongside the technical framework. The human account of why this matters." He nodded, and she could see him already composing it in his mind. "Webb," she said as he turned to go. He looked back. "You asked me on the range whether I was happy after the shot," she said. "I told you I was relieved, that the conversation could finally begin." She paused. "This right now, this is closer to happy. He held that for a moment. Then he smiled briefly and genuinely in the way of someone receiving something they weren't expecting. He left. She went back to the proposal. Whitmore read the completed document on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after Sarah had begun it. He read it without interruption, which for a man who managed his attention across approximately 14 competing institutional priorities, simultaneously was itself a statement of something. His aide knocked twice during the reading. Whitmore waved him away both times without looking up. When he finished, he sat with it for a moment. Then he called Reynolds. Reynolds arrived in 3 minutes, which suggested he had been nearby and expecting the call. Whitmore set the document on the desk between them and said, "Read the section beginning on page 9. Reynolds read it. His face went through several things during the reading. At one point he stopped and looked up and then looked back down and kept reading without saying anything. When he finished, he set the document down with the care of someone setting down something that has more weight than its physical form suggests. "She's building what Halverson lost," he said. "She's building it better," Whitmore said. "Because she has 9 years of field experience with how the methodology performs under real conditions, which he never had the opportunity to collect. The original program was shut down before it could generate that kind of longitudinal data." Reynolds was quiet. "My name is going on the institutional backing," Whitmore said. "I want yours beside it." Reynolds looked at him, then at the document, then back. "Yes," he said. "There was no performance in it, no calculation. Just a man who had spent 11 years running evaluations with one set of eyes, deciding with the minimum of drama to use a different set from here forward." "Yes, sir, absolutely." Whitmore nodded. Then he picked up the phone and called Portland. Halvorsen answered on the third ring. His voice was steadier than it had been 2 weeks ago. The speech therapy was making progress. His daughter had told Sarah faster than the therapists had initially projected. He sounded, Whitmore thought, like a man who had been given a reason to put effort into his recovery. "I've read your framework," Whitmore said. "The handwritten documents, all of them." A pause. "Commander Mitchell put them in the proposal," Whitmore continued. "With full attribution. Your name, your methodology, the original program designation." He paused. "The proposal is going forward with my backing and my training officer's backing, and I expect it to receive program authorization within the next 60 days. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone without words. It was the silence of someone whose body needs a moment to process something before the mind can form language around it. "The framework," Halvorsen said finally. His voice was careful, steady. "It works. I knew it worked. I had the results." "I've seen the results," Whitmore said. "In the file and in person last week on a range in Nevada." A breath. "She told me about the shot. It was the finest piece of precision work I've ever personally witnessed," Whitmore said. And he was not a man who spoke in superlatives, and Halvorsen would know that and would understand accordingly what the statement meant. Another silence. "I built that rifle for a 19-year-old, Halvorsen said quietly. She could barely hold the weight of it properly. Her hand position was wrong for 3 months before her muscle structure adapted." A pause. "I told her the rifle would learn her. She thought I was being poetic." "Were you?" A small sound. "Partially. The rifle did learn her, but she learned it back, and that's the harder half of the equation." He paused. "How is she?" "She's building your program," Whitmore said. "With the parts of it that she carried for 9 years, and the parts of it you've been writing down for 3, and the parts that are entirely hers, because she's had experiences with the methodology that you never got to have." He paused. "She's going to do it right." Halvorsen was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had a quality that was not quite composed and was not trying very hard to be. "I'd like to see it," he said. "When it's ready, when there's something to see." A pause. If that's possible." "Consider it arranged," Whitmore said. The formal review finding landed on a Monday morning 6 weeks after the file had opened. Whitmore read it at his desk before anyone else arrived. It was 47 pages long and written in the specific bloodless language of institutional accountability, precise, documented, impossible to misread. The reclassification had been found to be unsupported by operational facts. The original assessment by Program Director Dr. Eric Halverson had been found to accurately reflect the events of the operation in question. The personnel records of Commander Sarah Mitchell were to be corrected to reflect her actual service history, including the operational contributions that had been removed. 2 individuals who had authorized the reclassification were named. Both had already retired. Both would face a formal review process that the document carefully and without editorializing described as ongoing. The file that had been buried for 4 years was now permanently and officially open. Whitmore had the finding on his desk at 7:15 in the morning. At 7:30, he called Sarah. She answered immediately, which meant she had been awake and probably had been for some time. "It's done," he said. A long pause. "All of it," she said. "All of it. The correction, the attribution, the review finding." Halverson's assessment is formally designated as accurate and entered into the permanent record. He paused. "Your service history is corrected effective today. Everything you actually did is now in the official record, correctly attributed under your name." The pause that followed was the longest one he had heard from her. "Sir," she said finally, and her voice had something in it that was not entirely controlled, and she didn't try to make it so. "I need a few minutes." "Take all the time you need," he said. He set the phone down. In a room somewhere in the facility, Sarah Mitchell sat with the news that she had been waiting 9 years to receive and let herself feel the weight of what it meant to no longer have to carry it alone. She didn't cry. That wasn't quite right. She had done her crying for this years ago in private moments she had never shown anyone, and what remained now was something past that. Something that was the feeling of a structure coming down that you have been holding up with your body for so long that you have forgotten it is not part of you. The sudden, almost physical sensation of space where the weight used to be. She picked up the rifle case and held it in her lap for a moment, both hands on the latches, not opening it. Just holding the thing that had held her story through all the years no one else was holding it. "We did it," she said quietly. To the room. To the rifle. To the man in Portland who had built it, and who she would call in 10 minutes, and who was going to hear the words she had spent 9 years preparing to say to him. Then she set the case down, squared her shoulders, and went to make the call. Hooper heard the news through official channels an hour after Whitmore notified him directly, and the 2 accounts together. The formal institutional language and Whitmore's plain human voice produced in him a response that he had not entirely anticipated. He had thought he would feel vindicated. He had thought on the days when he allowed himself to imagine this moment that there would be something clean and satisfying about it. A resolution. A completion. What he actually felt was more complicated and more human than that. There was relief, enormous and real. And underneath the relief was something that had been living there for 4 years, waiting for the relief to move aside, so it could be properly addressed, a grief for the version of things that should have happened. For the 4 years. For the element members who had deserved to know the true account of their rescue, and had been given a false one instead. For what Sarah had been asked to carry, and had carried without complaint, while the institution that created the burden went about its business. He called his element sergeant first. Not Whitmore's recommendation, his own decision. Because the right order of things was that the men who had been in that position deserved to hear from him before they heard it through any other channel. The conversation was difficult and necessary, and absolutely the right call. His sergeant, a man named Diaz, who had left service 2 years ago and was now running a construction business in San Diego, went very quiet when Hooper told him what had actually happened. And then Diaz said, "I knew something wasn't right. In the debrief, I knew it." And his voice had the particular quality of someone whose instinct had been overruled by authority, and who has spent years quietly carrying the wrongness of that without being able to articulate why. "There was someone on the hillside," Hooper said. 3,600 meters away. She made a single shot in a 90-second window, and we walked out of there." Diaz was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Does she know that we know now?" "She will," Hooper said. He called 6 more men that day. Every conversation was different, and all of them arrived at the same place, The particular complicated emotional territory of people who have been given a corrected version of their own story and are now doing the work of integrating it. Of understanding that the rescue they had carried as one thing was actually a different thing, a more remarkable thing, performed by a person they had never known to thank. On Wednesday of the following week, Whitmore arranged a call. Not a formal proceeding, not a documented institutional event. A call. Sarah was in the intelligence support office when it connected. Whitmore had told her only that she had a call at 1400 and that she should take it in the secure line room. She had not asked for details because she had learned in her years of working with people who operated at levels where information was controlled for good reasons that sometimes the right response to incomplete information is patient presence rather than interrogation. She picked up the secure line at exactly 1400. Mitchell. She recognized Hooper's voice immediately. She had not heard it in 4 years. It was older, not diminished, just carried more of what those 4 years had contained. "Hooper," she said. A pause. "I have 6 men on this line," he said. 7 including me. Element members from the operation. I told them. They asked if there was a way to... He stopped. Steadied. They wanted to say something directly. She gripped the phone. Diaz went first. His voice was direct and without performance. "Commander Mitchell, I'm told you were 3,600 meters away and you had 90 seconds. I'm told you made 1 shot. A pause. "I have 4 kids. My youngest is 2. She exists because you were on that hillside." Another pause. "I don't have words for what that means, but I needed you to know that I know." She pressed her lips together hard. The next man spoke. And the next. 7 men, one at a time, each with their own version of the same thing, the acknowledgement. The weight of knowing the specific human reality of a debt that can't be repaid, and doesn't need to be, but needs to be named. One of them, she didn't catch his name, because her hearing had narrowed slightly in the way it does when emotion is pressing against the professional composure you've been maintaining. One of them said simply, "Thank you for staying in the fight. For not walking away from the uniform after what they did to you. Thank you for that." She hadn't expected that one. She had to breathe carefully for a moment before she could speak. When all 7 had finished, Hooper came back. "We're going to Portland," he said. "Diaz organized it. 6 of us, as many of the element as can make it, we're going to see Halverson." A pause. "We thought you should know." She nodded, which he couldn't see. "Tell him I said you're coming," she managed. "Give him a few days' notice. He'll want to be ready." "Will you be there?" Hooper asked. She thought about that. About a room in Portland with Halverson, and the men he had helped come home, about what that reunion would contain and what it would ask of everyone in it. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." 3 weeks later, the Black Ridge Precision Development Program was formally authorized. The name had been Whitmore's suggestion, straightforward and descriptive, and Sarah had accepted it because the work was more important than what it was called. The authorization came with a budget allocation, a curriculum review timeline, and a staffing plan that included 2 senior instructors and a position for a program director. The program director position was offered to Sarah. Reynolds delivered the offer in person, which Whitmore had asked him to do, and which Reynolds had agreed to without hesitation. He came to the range where she was running a morning session with Webb and Carver, and 3 other shooters who had quietly but definitively become regulars in the days since the evaluation. He waited until the session reached a natural break. Then he walked up to her and said, "The program director position. We'd like you to take it." She looked at him. "Not as a courtesy," he said. "Not as an institutional correction. As the most qualified person for the role." He paused and something moved briefly in his face. The acknowledgement, the cost of it, the honesty behind it. "You've been the most qualified person in this building since you arrived. We just didn't have the eyes to see it." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I'll take it." Reynolds held out his hand. She shook it. Webb, who had heard the exchange from 12 feet away and was doing a poor job of pretending he hadn't turned away to give them a moment. But his face when he turned had the expression of someone watching something be put right, that has been wrong for a long time, and finding that the feeling of it is not a small thing. The trip to Portland happened on a Saturday in the third week of October. Halvorson's daughter had set up the living room for them. Chairs arranged in a loose circle, the practical furniture of a family home made to serve a different purpose for the afternoon. Halvorson was in the chair nearest the window, where the light was best. He had lost weight since Sarah had last seen him, and his left side showed the effects of the stroke in ways she had known intellectually, but hadn't been fully prepared for emotionally. But his eyes, when they found hers across the room, were precisely the eyes she remembered. Alert, warm, seeing. 7 men came. Hooper, Diaz, and 5 others. Some of them still carrying the physical evidence of years in service. Some of them softened into civilian life in ways that didn't diminish the quality of who they were. They filled the room with the particular energy that Sarah had always associated with men who have been in difficult places together and carry the specific loyalty that those places produce. Halvorson looked at them for a long moment before he spoke. "I didn't know if I'd ever have this," he said. His speech was slightly slow, the therapy's work visible in the careful placement of each word. But the words themselves were entirely his. "I knew what we did was real. Mitchell knew. The results were in the file, and the file was locked, and for a long time I thought that was where it would stay." He looked around the room. "I was wrong. And being wrong about that is the best thing that's happened to me in a long time." Hooper said, "We came to say thank you, to both of you, for what you built, for what it did." He paused. "And to say it shouldn't have taken this long." "No," Halvorson agreed. "It shouldn't." The simplicity of that acknowledgement landed without drama and with considerable weight. They talked for 3 hours. About the operation, about the years since, about what the program had been, and what it was becoming. Halvorson asked precise technical questions about the Black Ridge proposal that told Sarah he had read every page of the document she had sent him, annotated it in the margins, and had opinions about several sections that he delivered with the particular confidence of a man who knows exactly what he's talking about. She pushed back on 2 of them. He conceded one and held the other with a counter-argument that she acknowledged after a moment was correct. Diaz watched that exchange with visible surprise. Hooper leaned over to him and said quietly, "What did you expect?" Diaz shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I don't know what I expected." Before the afternoon ended, one of the Element members, a quiet man named Torres, who had said little but listened to everything, spoke up. "Commander Mitchell," he said, "can I ask you something?" She looked at him. "The shot," he said, "the one that got us out. When you were in that position waiting for the window, what were you thinking about?" It was the kind of question that gets asked with genuine curiosity and deserves a genuine answer. She thought about it. "I was thinking about the fact that I had one window," she said, "and that the window would come, not when I wanted it, when it was ready." She paused. "And I was thinking, don't be early, don't be impatient, don't push." She looked at Torres steadily. "I was thinking exactly what someone told me to think, a long time before I was in that position." Everyone in the room knew who she meant. Halvorson looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. And the expression on his face in that moment was not pride in the teacher's sense of the word, not ownership, not credit. It was something purer than that. The expression of someone watching a thing they helped to grow exist fully and completely in the world, independent of them belonging to itself. "You did good," he said simply. She held his gaze. "You gave me something worth doing good with," she said. The room was very quiet. Outside, October was doing what October does in Oregon. The light was going earlier, the temperature dropping toward the cold end of the spectrum, the year beginning its long turn toward winter. None of it was visible from where they sat. But everyone in the room could feel the quality of the afternoon, ending the particular fullness of a day that has contained what it needed to contain and is now moving toward its natural conclusion. Whitmore had not come to Portland. He had understood without being told that this gathering was not for him. His role had been to open the door. What happened on the other side of it belonged to different people. He was in his office on a Saturday afternoon, which was not unusual for him working through the administrative requirements of the program authorization. But at 1400, he set the paperwork aside. I thought about what Sarah had said the morning the review finding came in. The sentence she had spoken to the rifle case, which she probably didn't know. His aide had overheard through the door that wasn't quite fully closed. We did it. Not I. We. After all of it. The 9 years. The invisibility. The carried weight. The institutional machinery that had tried to reduce her to a function and failed because people cannot ultimately be reduced to functions. They persist, and they carry, and they wait, and they find the wind window. After all of it, the first thing she had said was, "we." That told him everything about the kind of person she was. Everything about why Halverson had built her a rifle at 19 and told her it would learn her. Everything about why Webb had asked to write his testimony, and Carver had asked the real questions, and Hooper had organized 7 men to make a phone call, and Diaz had looked at Torres across that living room in Portland, with the expression of men who understand finally and completely that the story they were told was not the whole story. The whole story was larger and better, and it had been there the entire time, waiting quietly for the moment when someone would say, "Your turn." The Black Ridge Precision Development Program opened its first formal training cycle 11 weeks after authorization. Sarah Mitchell stood in front of the first cohort, 12 personnel drawn from multiple branches and specializations, assembled on the basis of aptitude assessments rather than assignment categories, and said nothing for 20 seconds. She let the silence work. Then she said, "You were not selected because of what you've done. You were selected because of what you haven't done yet." She looked around the room. "Everything you know about this discipline is the foundation. What you're going to build on it, that's what we're here for." She picked up the old rifle from the table beside her. "This was built for me by the best teacher I ever had," she said. "He told me it would learn me. He was right. It took time. It took more patience than I thought I had." She set it back down. "That's what this program is, not a shortcut, a relationship. Between you and the discipline, between you and the conditions, between you and the understanding that the world doesn't owe you a perfect moment. You wait for the window. You read the system. You don't push." She paused. "And when the window comes, you take your shot." Outside, the Nevada desert was doing what it always did. Different. Complicated. Full of wind systems that moved in layers and changed every 90 seconds, and didn't care about anyone's preparation or reputation or years of training. The flags across the valley moved in their patterns. The same patterns they had always moved in, the same patterns they would continue to move in, long after everyone who had stood on that range had moved on to whatever came next. But the record was different now. The record said what had actually happened, and the woman who had made it happen was standing in front of a room of 12 people who didn't know yet what they were capable of holding. The knowledge that someone had once held for her, ready to give it forward. Some stories take 9 years to arrive at their proper beginning. This one had finally